How about feed-in tariffs? Now, in Europe, we've had feed-in tariffs for a while in a number of countries to incentivize the uptake of renewables, and there are those who say we don't really need them anymore. We don't need them at the level anymore they're at. They can be phased out over time. Perhaps in other countries, you work in African contexts a lot, they're more needed to develop and build a system up from the ground. What is your take on whether we still need feed-in tariffs and to what extent we need them?
I think we're going to need them less and less. And also, governments are restructuring feed-in tariffs so that they're competitive auctions or contracts for difference. So it's costing the consumers and taxpayers a lot less. Mm-hmm. But I do believe that renewables are becoming more and more competitive without feed-in tariffs. So they can compete on the market as long as there's a level playing field. And having a level playing field means that there has to be a price for polluting. Mm-hmm. You know, if you the companies who are competing with fossil fuels need to either have carbon sequestration or pay a very large fine for emitting carbon.
The key idea of feed-in tariffs was to make, they've been primarily used for solar, to make them more competitive to the existing electricity, which is largely coming from coal-fired or gas-fired power stations. As the electricity produced from solar equals the levelized cost of energy from those other sources, then there really isn't a need to use feed-in tariffs. I think personally that feed-in tariffs, one of the problems around feed-in tariffs is they are complex to run, to the governance around feed-in tariffs. So if you're trying to introduce feed-in tariffs, and I think this is where we're looking at this in the relationship to least developed countries particularly, is they may be an inappropriate regulatory device because of the complexity of coordinating and running those. Although, the other side of that could be that new technologies and the use of digital technologies, mobile phones, etc., could facilitate a different type of feed-in tariff, a different way of designing feed-in tariffs, and that's localized, and you have a microfinance approach, that maybe is run by local district authorities rather than having a national feed-in tariff. So maybe it's more about rethinking feed-in tariffs. Often regulatory tools have a sort of fad period. They're in fashion, and then suddenly it's like, well, that doesn't work anymore. To find later on that you are using it, but it's in a different format, So, again, nearly all the time it comes down to context and a different way of perhaps looking at what's needed in a different context.
Yeah, and some of the very strong targets for renewable energy have called forth the capacity from the supply chain. And I think that's something which we should expect to follow in the future. Strong renewable supply components are at the forefront of the majority of the INDCs. Renewable energy is the largest growth area that we see within the global energy economy. These trends are extremely positive, but at the same time, there's some underlying friction. Some of the benefits have not necessarily been visited upon local consumers who end up paying very, very high premiums relative to, say, wholesale electricity prices to support the transmission and distribution network, to support some of the feed-in tariffs. Retail energy prices are extremely high in key markets like Germany, where there's perhaps been the greatest experiment. And it remains to be seen whether there's perhaps a crisis looming where consumers essentially say, I'm not willing to pay that premium anymore, whatever the relative merits of the power system that you've developed. However green it may be, it's not affordable.
In Europe, we've been using, for most, Germany's a great example, Britain's not a great example, Spain's a good example, using feed-in tariffs. And that's an incentive-based tool to encourage producers with solar, with more domestic utilities, and to sell to the grid, and they would get a premium for doing so. And then there could be an obligation on the grid to buy that electricity. And they would get this premium over a period of time. It may have a de-escalation, as it did in Germany. So as the price goes down in terms of production, they're not always getting this premium at a set level. So these incentive mechanisms, they're very useful at the start, but as the price goes down, which has happened with solar, maybe you don't need them. So you need to target the renewable energy that's coming up further. You need to focus on encouraging new technologies or improved technologies.
In certain instances, the break-even points, we're talking about the most optimal conditions. When we suggest that renewables have reached parity with thermal generation, there's a lot of hidden costs which tend to be put to one side. We're very rarely talking about transmission and distribution charges when we're talking about the levelized cost of electricity. There's some very, it's creative accounting, and it's important because the improvement does need to be shown, and I think in many ways has been a transformative aspect of the energy economy, the way in which solar costs in particular have fallen over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. It's one of the more remarkable stories, perhaps alongside unconventional upstream production that the global energy economy has seen. Now, in the less ideal type, then those technologies will continue to warrant a degree of support. And I think that one of the things that's quite, a subtle inflection point is that what was hitherto a peripheral concern, renewables, has basically become the mainstream and the core of the power sector in the majority of countries. Certainly that's been the European experience. Many North American markets would echo this, and I think that trends will continue to spread in other parts of the world. And with that, big, very, very large integrated energy companies have moved into that space. So while the small residential consumer that put up a solar panel on the basis of a particular promised return is chagrined at the pace with which policies have been rolled back and degrees of support have been withdrawn, the large energy companies are sufficiently diversified to take the opportunity that goes along with tariffs in certain jurisdictions, can weather the storm when they're reduced in others. And renewables have become such a core part of the business that that's in a way the challenge is creating that balance in and around a technology that still is mandated on the basis of its climate dividend. That's that at essence, although it's a core concern in the mainstream, that's because it's zero carbon. That's because of the way that it contributes to climate change. And in that space, there's always going to be inherent volatility because it's the vagaries of politics that decide the scope for this technology in the market. And that, that creates a huge amount of risk for would-be investors.